Now we're excited to hear from Scott Moore, the founder of Gitcoin, a platform connecting the community developing digital public goods. The narratives we choose and the tools we build deeply shape the world around us. In this talk, Scott makes the case that we must collectively choose more regenerative, positive sum ideals that align more with the Solarpunk future to solve many of the problems we face around how we manage our global commons. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate just everyone being here. I think this is such an important conversation to have, and Filecoin and Protocol Labs have been doing a great job bringing people together, I think, around this shared narrative of what 21st century commons actually look like. So as mentioned, today, really my goal is to kind of zoom out a little bit from the idea of particular tools, particular technologies, and talk just generally about almost narratives and why we're sort of interested in trying to build a Solarpunk future, why we're interested in building a kind of tools for change in Web3 in general. And so I'll go through this in 4 parts. Firstly, what is Solarpunk? Why does it matter? What is sort of the use of it in defining the models for public goods? And then practically speaking, how do we build it? What does it look like in practice to actually create the Solarpunk future that we want to see? So for those of you not familiar, the idea of basically Solarpunk has a long history that goes back actually to cyberpunk origins. There's a long history even beyond this, but just for simplicity, we'll kind of start here. And cyberpunk, I think most people are familiar with these days. In fact, I think in many ways we're too familiar with it. David Graeber talked about the idea that in 2012, 2013, we hadn't really done a good job of defining the futures we want to see, and we sort of failed to imagine where we wanted to go as a society. But I would argue that with cyberpunk, we've almost done worse, in the sense that we've started to create an almost dystopian fiction or a narrative around the futures that we want to see. And for anyone who's watched cyberpunk media all the way from like the new wave original sort of inception of it in the 70s through to things like Blade Runner and Neuromancer in the 80s, we see a general combination of low life and high tech, which is really emblematic of this sort of dystopian world in which megacorps or large behemoth governments have taken over almost all functions of society, while some kind of fading rebel alliance aims at trying to restore order in the world. And in the 90s, we sort of saw a little bit of a reemergence of a more hopeful and more almost resistant narrative through the cypherpunk initiative and movement. And this movement was, while I think a step in the right direction, much more targeted at the idea of individual strong cryptography and privacy. You can make it if you really put your energy and your time into building the future you want to see. And I think, although this is certainly a good narrative, and I think we all sort of, many of us at least, resonate with the ideas of cypherpunk culture, the problem I see is that it really focuses on the individual. It focuses fundamentally on social and political change by, the elite hacker, the single person just building in their garage, the, sort of Web 2 Silicon Valley narrative that we all sort of know and are familiar with today. And I think what we want to move towards, ultimately, in my view, and this is obviously what I'm here to sort of argue today, is a Solarpunk future, one which envisions not this sort of pessimistic dystopian future as posited by the cyberpunk sort of like enthusiasts, and not really the individual kind of every man, every person for themselves world that the cypherpunks envisioned, but rather a kind of combination of both collective and individual action towards a future in which technology is part of a general sort of environment that we live in versus being a sort of, I suppose, the only thing that we care about. Ultimately, we want to focus on how we sustain society in the context of other broader initiatives that we care about. Like the climate is, kind of the obvious one that comes to mind in the Solarpunk art and movement to date, which started arguably around 2008, largely as something focusing on a sort of post-financial crisis need to return to sustainability from arguably unchecked growth. But I think there's a broader collective set of principles that we can start to assign to the Solarpunk movement as we think about what it actually means to build a Solarpunk future where technology and the environment and people collectively work hand in hand towards a better world. So in summary, cyberpunk is this kind of pessimistic, gritty, arguably fascinating, high-tech and low-life world, but it's not where we want to be. And Solarpunk alternatively provides a narrative that's much more high-tech and high-life and emphasizes this deep integration between technology, our environment, and this sort of general convivial conservation, self-sustainability, and social inclusiveness. And I think the importance of this is that it marks a new beginning for us narratively. And I think we often forget about the fact that most of the things that we rely on in the world today are narratives themselves. So nation states really in their current form have only existed for a few hundred years. They've arguably been a success in many cases. I'm not suggesting that the nation state doesn't do things that are good, but I think that ultimately we become very dependent on the narrative that nation states are the only thing that can bring us peace and prosperity in the long run. And I think this is, generally speaking, misguided for the same reason that trying to focus in on long sort of like term economic growth above all else is a problem. And of course, this is something that many of you might be familiar with in the context of Karl Polanyi, who talked about sort of the emergence of market societies versus market states or market economies, in which we sort of took away, as Illich would call it, convivial society or the vernacular sort of non-economic worlds and abstracted them alongside this sort of increase in institutional power into these entities that control almost all aspects of our lives. And I think that ultimately we can reject these ideas, we can consider new approaches, and the tools we're building, what we have in front of us with Web3 is actually something that I think is more than just technology. It is actually fundamentally a movement that allows us to really think deeply about new narratives that we might want to collectively see and to, for the first time, arguably, really enact those in the world versus sort of theorize about them. And so I just want to give two examples of, it's very easy to say at a high level that we should aim to move towards this sort of narrative and move towards a Solarpunk world. I think everyone wants to see a more positive, more optimistic. I think most people these days want to see a more environmentally friendly world. But I think practically speaking, it's worth noting that these have actually been, in large part, principles or ideals that have been implemented in other contexts already. And Ostrom is probably the most prominent example of this with a lot of her theories of commons management, which I won't go into in tremendous detail, but commons management really comes down to a set of 8 principles. And it really shows that if you set clear boundaries, define rules locally, create participatory procedures for editing those rules, and then creating sort of a set of accountable members alongside graduated conflict resolution when people end up defecting, that you can do a lot without actually having a large scale state or a large scale economic force governing the actual society itself. And Ostrom looked very deeply at a number of individual cases of this in the context of course, a lot of commons resources in local environments, pretty much around the world, actually, across Africa, Europe, even a bit in North America, but principally with physical resources. So things like fisheries, forestry. And I think that what's really important about this approach to commons management is that it shows that we often have the assumption, and in fact, this was what Ostrom wrote her work in opposition to, that there's this notion of a tragedy of the commons when people reach a resource that is finite in nature and potentially rivalrous. They will compete for that resource until it is pretty much gone. And you do see this happen in the world today. You see this happen with a number of key environmental resources, fish and fisheries being a prominent example, actually. But my view is that, and what Ostrom showed is that if you actually scale these nested structures correctly, you can make sure that these commons are sustained without running into this sort of tragedy in a way that doesn't require you to, as I mentioned, to have these sort of state and market overhang entities. The other example, which is sort of similar in nature, is related to Rochdale principles and cooperativism. And ultimately what Rochdale talked about was the idea of building voluntary open membership, creating sort of participatory processes for decisions, ensuring that everyone has skin in the game, so they have some kind of ownership in the actual cooperative as part of membership, and then that they have autonomy in their arrangements and are educated about what's happening in the network. The important piece of both of these models is this last point, which is point 7, which is that you're creating in both of these cases positive externalities for the community in the process of creating a model for sustaining a local environment. So there's an idea of kind of like localism that's present in both of these. There's an idea of kind of working with the environment versus working against it and sort of in opposition to it. And I view that these sort of models as a very clear sort of tangible case for the fact that if we work together, we can actually create these sorts of alternatives to the models that we had in the past. And I think that, one question that immediately arises for anyone who sees this, and it's been a question even in Web3 conversations around DAOs, is, well, what happens when these relationships scale? What happens when commons scale? And of course, it is much more complicated when things do scale like this, because the relationships between people, as the number of people grow, it grows exponentially. And ultimately what that means in practice is that Dunbar's number takes effect. And effectively what that says is that after 150 people, it's very difficult for anyone to actually get a sense of, true friendship with someone else, because they really have a cognitive limit on the number of people that they can really get to know. And so as that happens, we lose our sense of connection, we lose our sense of solidarity, and it can be easy for us to fall in these sorts of traps. Sometimes these are called even like multipolar traps in the context of various economic models. But the problem fundamentally is just that we lose the ability to coordinate and we opt to defect. And so I believe that we can actually find an alternative to this sort of doomerism and take ownership back over our institutions, use these coordination tools in Web3 to fight for causes we believe in. And perhaps most fundamentally, we can now actually mint our own cooperative currencies to create funding for efforts that otherwise wouldn't exist. So in turn, by creating these models and by creating these currencies, we're able to be regen, not degen. And there's some really great work by a number of folks throughout Web3, but especially other internet inverses, that discusses some of these ideas in more detail that I would love for folks to check out. In particular, I'll shout out to Positive Sum Worlds, which is other internet's kind of seminal piece on the way in which we might think about these larger commons. And to be clear, when I say commons, we're talking about kind of a conflation of two things, right? So the traditional model of public goods defines common goods as things that are governable under the Austrian principles. For example, fish, timber, coal, natural resources are typical, like very good examples of this. But we also have things like clean air, roads and bridges, things that, privacy is much more sort of esoteric, but is important in its own right. I think that the difference between these as communities scale becomes almost zero. And you can think about it this way. So if you consider, roads and bridges as common infrastructure, as public infrastructure, you start to think about the notion of it as, usable by and non-excludable to anyone. And the problem with that is that, if you don't have a driver's license, if you are not allowed into the country for various reasons, if there are other issues going on that prevent you from accessing those environments, you no longer have those really as a public good for everyone. And the question becomes, what is the public that we're talking about? And what I think the idea of common goods, or the idea of the commons, really gets right is that we're really talking about goods that are local to an environment with a particular public in mind. When we talk about public goods, unfortunately, we get to this nebulous territory in which the notion of the public is just too broad for us to really consider, what we're talking about. And so often I think we get into this case where the things we call public goods on one hand are perhaps not public at all, like roads or bridges, or they're public in a certain sense. And on the other hand, we run into this problem of we are making this categorical distinction between commons and public goods that might actually in some cases be in the context of Web3 and the tools we're building, preventing us from thinking deeply about the problems at hand. And so one example that I think is particularly prominent for Gitcoin, which is principally an internet native community for funding digital public goods, although we've expanded beyond that a little bit, as I'll get to, is the idea of funding open source software as this sort of global public good. And I think the problem with our kind of like consideration of that is that we're really assuming that the commons model can't apply to governing essentially something that might be accessible and sort of non-rivalrous in the world at large. But I would argue that if we start to think again about positive externalities, these two types of goods become more similar than we think. And I think the better way to frame and the more Solarpunk way to sort of define public goods comes down to effectively, and this is not novel in the context of a lot of economic thinking, but thinking about the difference sort of between market failure and value to community and where goods fall on the spectrum. So with Kernel, which is a Web3 education community that we run, we actively try to sort of like, in some sense, gatekeep access in the sense that we want to make sure it's a very small community, accessible only to a certain number in the cohort at a time. And it's just to make sure that, of course, the experience is good for everyone who's in that cohort. But the problem with this in the public goods context is that we're considering this to be effectively going back to the original model of club good. And arguably, you could say in some contexts, you could consider it a common good. But the problem is that we're creating in this model, and as many DAOs are as well, a lot of positive externalities in the education that's being provided and the value to community. And so ultimately, we are running into this problem in which the previous framing of public goods, as we start to think about DAOs at scale providing basically value to global commons, is not being accurately measured relative to the failures of existing markets to fund those types of goods. So in short, what we need to think about is, first of all, positive externalities a good is providing, and secondly, essentially the level at which, or the deficit we currently have in terms of the amount of funding available for those goods. The large scale, I think, unlock that this provides is that we can actually think about the things we're building Web3 not just as these speculative tools that might be related to DeFi or NFTs, but we can think of them as new models for addressing our global commons and addressing public goods at large, to address these longstanding inequalities that might be present even in, say, open source software, in which a maintainer might be maintaining a library for 10 years, ultimately just at the as a side sort of gig for themselves, while getting none of the returns or none of the benefit from the work that they're providing to the broader global commons. And I think that we really need to start thinking deeply about the regenerative economic systems we can create that address these inequalities. And if we think in terms of positive externalities, I think it's very easy for us to see that even some tools or systems that are being built now, like KlimaDAO, which have their own problems in terms of being sort of speculative models for basically decentralized finance, they actually provide a pretty interesting set of economics for doing good and creating positive externalities in the world. And I think that ultimately, if we are deeply kind of considerate of the models we're building in Web3, we can actually make regenerative economics, Web3, all of the things we're doing Solarpunk. And I think reframing what we're doing in that narrative and thinking deeply about this idea of a global commons is actually a better framing than perhaps the traditional public goods model. So I just want to highlight a few tools that have been really actively on my mind that are doing a good job, in my opinion, to kind of forward a more Solarpunk vision for the world. One of them is, of course, digital signatures like ENS. Their work with identity is, I think, paramount effectively to creating a, I guess, user-owned system for managing value and managing our sort of, I guess, perception in the metaverse. The problem with basically meta that people have, for example, is that we're taking agency away from people in the process of creating a new sort of system for value that ends up replicating a lot of the same problems as in traditional nation state or market society models, which is fundamentally just that like markets will run rampant, certain people will get left behind, and you'll end up with a system in which ultimately that value is controlled by, and the systems that value is engaged in is controlled by a small group of people versus by the users and owners themselves. And I think these same principles apply to decentralized storage systems like IPFS and Filecoin. I think there's a really good case to be made that actually there's a lot of room for considering those two things in almost one bucket of tools for progress. And I want to shout out in particular the work that IPFS, Filecoin, Protocol Labs have already done towards the DUI principles on this front. I think that's actually on its own a really interesting narrative towards a Solarpunk future. And I just want to really highlight the work that's actually happening around funding as well, which of course Gitcoin is one part of, but ultimately, there's many other examples of projects that are doing good work in this area, including Optimism, which is principally working on the idea of retro public goods funding, which going back to the sort of idea of open source software maintainers not being properly incentivized is fundamentally a problem of, at the very least, them not being given commensurate value historically as back pay for work that they've done. There's a question of should we pay them up front or should we pay them for work that they've value generated? And I think the answer essentially there is both. And then finally, there's this sort of idea of DAOs, which I've touched on briefly, and we are principally working as a DAO in the Gitcoin community today. The problem with DAOs fundamentally is that we are building almost another set of, walled gardens. And when we do this, despite the idea that these can produce positive externalities, we run the risk of really unintentionally centralizing a lot of the things we initially set out to decentralize. It's very possible for us to run into the same types of problems that, the cyberpunk futurists were fighting against and talking about in the first place. But I think that modular governance tooling is actually particularly useful in terms of kind of allowing projects to build the nested commons of the types that Ostrom talks about versus building large monolithic groups. And we've actually started to implement some of these ideas in the context of how we're governing our own project. In the context of, for example, Kernel, we've spun them out in order to fund them as their own sort of work stream, as their own sort of independent governance body versus thinking about them as, just one part of a large monolith. A constellation of projects is always, in my view, more resilient and more likely to be successful than one single project. And there's a few really interesting, sites to check out on this front. Clarity's done some really interesting work with signing with Ethereum, which is related to the ENS ecosystem. There's a really good post actually even on the ENS governance forum about a credibly sort of neutral identity provider system. And with Quadratic Funding, of course, the goal really there is to get democratic funding to any group of projects based on the sentiment of a given community. So if you have 20 projects, in the ENS ecosystem that want to be funded, ultimately you want to distribute your funding if you have a grants program via the will of the community versus trying to decide what the community wants on your own. The next grants round, actually, grants round 13, is continuing sort of on this theme with rounds from Uniswap. We have one with Polygon, and we also have these kind of cause rounds focused on, again, the idea that there are these large-scale public goods that have been, I think, neglected because they don't fit easily into our traditional model of what a government funds or what is managed in the context of the commons. And I think that we can start to rethink these things in a Solarpunk sort of framing if we start to, if we actually take the time to really double down on the narratives that we're promoting as an ecosystem. And so just to close, I really want to emphasize that this is one idea, and I think it's one that we've really been trying to promote for the last, 2 years really actively. It's actually started to sort of take hold, and that's been amazing to see. But I genuinely believe that we're missing out on a potential for an optimistic, positive sum future if we don't choose to build a more Solarpunk one. And I think that it's incumbent on us to work together and to build that as a collective society, as a collective group in Web3. It's all coordination. Thank you very much.